Welcome to day 6 of PR 30. Today we're going to be talking about Plato's Apology. Specifically, as an introduction to Socrates as the founder of Western philosophy. Apology is a word that we usually think as saying sorry, but in the old sense of the word, or if you've heard the term apologetics as it refers to Christianity, apology refers to defense. And so Plato's Apology is effectively a defense not only of Socrates before the Athenian Senate, but a defense of all of philosophy. Socrates as a figure is somebody who was known for going around Athens and asking its citizens and different philosophers and people who considered themselves wise questions that exposed them in ways and asked them to examine their lives. When he did those things, what we see is something like the introduction of what we now know as Western philosophy. And when he is tried and eventually put to death, that is a death that hangs over all of Western philosophy to this day. I would say it's up there in terms of the crucifixion of Christ, in terms of influential deaths and persecutions that happened in history and continue to influence us and affect us today. So we're just going to run through the apology. I'm going to give a brief summary, and we're going to read through a few excerpts to sort of give you the gist of what's going on here. But it starts with Socrates before the Athenian Senate, and he, there's the case against him, and so he makes this long defense of answering the charges brought up against him. And you can think of him as just delivering this long speech that sort of not only justifies, it doesn't even really justify. This long speech explaining what he's up to and how he's more of a benefit to Athens than he's getting credit for. And he's trying to do them a favor by introducing philosophy and trying to get them to care about what really matters. So he starts with the words, "How have you felt, O men of Athens, at hearing the speeches of my accusers?" And that's how he starts. And he says later, "Let the judge decide justly and the speaker speak truly." That's how he's talking about himself. And then he sort of launches into this idea of his answer to the accusations against him. And so the first group of accusers, calls them the slanderers. And he says, "They shall be my prosecutors, and I will sum up their words in an affidavit. Socrates is an evildoer and a curious person who searches into things under the earth and in heaven, and he makes the worse appear the better cause, and he teaches the aforesaid doctrines to others. This is the nature of their accusation." And then he talks about how they see the crux of this accusation in the poet Aristophanes had a poem called "The Clouds," where he sort of makes fun of Socrates in saying that he was somebody that lived in the clouds, that his philosophies and his ideas were up in the clouds and didn't have any bearing or practical grounding in reality. And that's this first accusation against him, which then Socrates kind of goes to great lengths to dismiss and say, look, all he's been trying to do is convince people to care about what they ought to care about, not material wealth, but to get them chiefly to care about the improvement of their soul. And when he gets accused of being airy, part of what he's being accused of, and this is what he talks about about a few times here, this idea of having an oracle or a genius or a higher voice that's something like a conscience instruct him on these matters. And he does appeal to that voice. And so he basically says, he says at one point, and I'll read the words here, "For the words which I speak are not mine. I will refer to a witness who is worthy of credit and will tell you why my wisdom, whether I have any or what sort, and what witness shall be the god of Delphi. And that witness shall be the god of Delphi." And what he's talking about here is just like the Oracle of Delphi, this idea of having an inner voice that follows him and instructs him that he's just trying to serve. After he introduces and sort of dismisses his first idea of that his philosophy exists entirely in the clouds, he then goes on to explain how the reason that people are saying this about him is because when he was told by the Oracle of Delphi that he is the wisest person, he didn't believe the Oracle of Delphi, so he decided to go all around Athens trying to find somebody wiser than himself. And all he did was he pissed a bunch of people off because he would ask them questions, and in asking them the questions sort of exposed their ignorance. And this is how Socrates eventually comes to the conclusion that, well, maybe he is the wisest person, because for all the others know nothing and think that they know, while Socrates knows nothing but knows that he knows nothing. In other words, everybody else that Socrates questions is pretending to know things when they really know nothing, while at least Socrates has the humility and wisdom to know that he knows nothing. Obviously, people don't take a liking or enjoy being accused and questioned and exposed in this way. Some of them were sophists, which meant that this is how they made their living, was based on this illusion that they held some sort of knowledge that people ought to pay them for. And so in a lot of ways, when Socrates exposed these people, he was compromising their way of making a living. So you can understand why they would be upset. Not justifying it, but you can understand psychologically why people started to call Socrates the gadfly of Athens, because he was pissing people off left and right. After Socrates explains that the reason people are upset with him is because he's been exposing them, this is what he says about those type of people. Why, what evil does he practice or teach? They do not know and cannot tell. But in order that they may not appear to be at a loss, they repeat the ready-made charges which are used against all philosophers about teaching things up in the clouds and under the earth, and having no gods, and making the worse appear the better cause. For they do not like to confess that their pretense of knowledge has been detected, which is the truth. And as they are numerous, ambitious, and energetic, and are all in battle array, and have persuasive tongues, they have filled your ears with their loud and inveterate calumnies. So what he's saying here is, it's like everybody that has ever been exposed, and they engage in this sort of name calling when they realize that logic isn't behind their cause. That's how they try to win this argument, is by attacking the person and their character and slander. And this is something we still see today. After bringing this up, Socrates goes to the second charge against him. And this is what he says. What do they say? Something of this sort, that Socrates is a doer of evil and a corrupter of the youth. He does not believe in the gods of the state, and he has other new divinities of his own. That's what he says this charge is. Now this one comes, Meletus is the name of the guy, the accuser on this front. And what Socrates does to dismiss this charge is he says, wait a second, on one hand you're saying that I'm introducing new gods, and on the other hand, you're also accusing me of believing in no God. And he's like, this is a contradiction. And so he kind of dismisses this one pretty easily, going a little bit back and forth. And then he sort of ends all of this, and he says, there's a hostility toward philosophy and knowledge, and speaking truth to power has caused the death of many good men and will cause the death of many more. But what he says is, this is where you're mistaken, he says. A man who is good for anything ought not to calculate the chance of living or dying. He ought only to consider whether in doing anything he's doing right or wrong, and whether what he's doing is right or wrong, acting the part of a good man or a bad. So Socrates is saying, listen, this happens all the time. People put good folks to death for speaking truth to power, but the heroic man, and this is why Socrates is so incredible, is because what he's saying here is that he doesn't fear death. What he fears is being unrighteous and unloyal to his conscience. So this is what sets the foundation of all of philosophy. Socrates, in defending here to the death the idea that philosophy is a good, caused it in so many ways to be solidified as something valuable in our conscience. And the fact that sort of people after Socrates' death looked at his death and said, you know, there seems to be something wrong about the fact that they put this guy to death, and there seems to be something right about what he died for. And so in so many ways, Socrates' death represents the birth of the value of philosophy that we still cherish to this day. Socrates, in talking about this dedication, says, God orders me to fulfill the philosopher's mission of searching into myself and other men. If I were to desert my post through fear of death, that would indeed be strange, and I might justly be arraigned in court for denying the existence of gods if I disobeyed the oracle because I was afraid of death. Then I should be fancying that I was wise when I was not wise. For I do nothing, this is a page later, for I do nothing but go about persuading you all, old and young alike, not to take thought for your persons or your properties, but first and chiefly to care about the greatest improvement of the soul. I tell you that virtue is not given by money, but that from virtue comes money and every other good of man, public as well as private. Page later. You have often heard me speak of an oracle or sign which comes to me, and is the divinity which Meletus ridicules as an indictment. This sign I have had ever since I was a child. This sign is a voice which comes to me and always forbids me to do something, which I am going to do, but never commands me to do anything, and that is what stands in the way of me becoming a politician. So this is where Socrates is saying, listen, I have this voice in my head, a law written on my heart like all of us, and my only job is to be loyal to it, not disobey it. And that's what he says has instructed him all his life. And it's fundamentally his charge of Athens is that the other men of Athens have for far too long been trying to ignore this thing we call a conscience and sort of violating the dictates of the soul in favor of the desires of the flesh. Now, this is only about half of the apology. The rest of the apology, Socrates sort of continues to make his case against Athens and give context for who he was, why he did what he did, and how all of this was just about his defense of virtue and the quality of the soul above all other things. This is also where we get Socrates' famous statement that the life which is unexamined is not worth living. And that the difficulty is not in avoiding death, but in avoiding unrighteousness, for that runs faster than death. There are many other gems of Socrates that are in the Plato's Apology. That's all we have time for in today's video. We'll probably talk a little bit more about it, just because Socrates and Socrates' life has played a fundamental role not only in the things I choose to write about with my first book, being Introduction to Philosophy, and the second, History of the Hero, but also in the shaping of the Western individual as a whole. Probably second only to Christ, Socrates is up there, somebody whose legacy lives on in each of us. And so I think it's worth remembering his story insofar as it comes to us from Plato if we want to understand ourselves. And that's what this project is about. But that's enough for today. Until next time, peace.